The Committee on Homeland Security will come to order. Without objection, the chair may declare the committee in recess at any point. The purpose of this hearing is to receive testimony on President Biden and Secretary Mayorkas' open border policies and how these failed policies have had a profound and devastating impact throughout our country. This is the second hearing in this committee's impeachment proceedings regarding Secretary Mayorkas. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. Last week, this committee opened impeachment proceedings against Department of Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas. This is not a policy difference. The truth is, Secretary Mayorkas has disregarded court orders, laws passed by the United States Congress, and has lied to the American people. Who wants a secretary that can just disregard the fundamental pillars of the Constitution? We can't tolerate that, whether they're a Republican or a Democrat. That's what we got out of our hearing last week. Today, we're here to examine the impact of those actions on the American people and launch into the substance and human cost of Secretary Mayorkas' open border policies. As a result of the reckless actions by Secretary Mayorkas, no American is safe. There is a fentanyl epidemic sweeping this nation. Roughly 150,000 Americans died from fentanyl poisoning in 21 and 22. That's more than the number of U.S. combat deaths in World War I and the Vietnam War combined. Fentanyl is ripping apart our families and destroying our communities. Over 50% of this poison is being smuggled from Mexico into Arizona before it's dispersed throughout the United States. The Grand Canyon State is on the front lines of this crisis, which is why we have had testimony by people who have related the impacts on that state. Now, you'll hear many of my colleagues on the left claim that fentanyl is a ports of entry problem. But in reality, just last year, the Border Patrol intercepted enough fentanyl between the ports of entry to kill every single American. And that's just what we've caught. We have no idea how much more fentanyl was brought in by the nearly 1.8 million known gotaways, not to mention the unknown gotaways. Border officials have told this committee in testimony that only 5 to 10% of the fentanyl coming across the border is actually seized. By redirecting so many Border Patrol agents from patrolling the border to assist with the processing and release of illegal aliens, Secretary Mayorkas has made it far easier to smuggle fentanyl across the southwest border. Because of Secretary Mayorkas' border crisis, American cities and neighborhoods are less safe. Secretary Mayorkas' refusal to enforce the law, which requires him to detain and remove illegal aliens, has tragically increased crime and endangered public safety across the country. Since fiscal year 2021, the Border Patrol arrested more than 41,000 aliens with criminal convictions, including more than 15,000 in fiscal year 23. That's up from just a little over 4,200 in FY 2019. Total convictions for assault, battery, and domestic violence among illegal aliens apprehended in FY 23 exceeded 1,200, compared to 299 in FY 19. These statistics do not reflect the illegal aliens with criminal records who have slipped through the system because agents just don't have enough time or information to vet them. Additionally, DHS has no way to determine if an alien has a criminal history in his home country unless that country reports the information to the United States government or the alien self-reports. Therefore, DHS is mainly only screening aliens at the border to determine if they have previously committed a crime in the United States. And because many of these aliens are coming to the United States for the first time, DHS has no idea whether they have a criminal history or not. On top of rushing the vetting process, Secretary Mayorkas is hamstringing ICE, making it easier for illegal aliens who commit crimes in the United States to stay here. Despite his supposed pledge to focus on removing threats to public safety, ICE is arresting fewer illegal aliens than previous administrations. In FY 2019, out of more than 143 administrative arrests, 86% were of criminal aliens. In FY 20, during the COVID-19 pandemic, it was 90%. Last fiscal year, a mere 43%. The consequences of this influx of criminal aliens is simply devastating. Again, as a result, no American is safe. Illegal aliens arriving in major cities like New York and Chicago are committing assault, theft, and even more heinous crimes. In one case, Daniel Hernandez Martinez, who arrived in New York in June 2023, has since committed at least 14 crimes, leading to 6 arrests, including the day after he arrived in New York City. In one instance, he, quote, grabbed a stranger by the hair, dragged her across the floor, and kicked her, end quote. Crimes stemming from illegal migrants are also happening in small towns across America. In May 2023, a Honduran national was charged with raping a teenage girl in a restaurant bathroom in Prattsville, Alabama. He had a prior criminal record in Honduras when apprehended, crossing into Texas illegally in November 21, but he was released into the interior anyway. As we learned in last week's hearing, as many as 85% of illegal aliens are currently being released on Secretary Mayorkas' watch. The Secretary himself admitted this during a trip to Eagle Pass just last week. And how could we forget the story of the Tambunga family? Alyssa Tambunga and her father and sister who sat across from us in this very hearing room. Alyssa lost her little 7-year-old Amelia and her grandmother Maria in a car crash caused by a human smuggler. We will sadly hear similar stories today. These crimes were wholly preventable, yet Secretary Mayorkas' policies enabled these criminals to enter our country and destroy these families' lives. It's despicable. While many of my Democrat colleagues likely feel the same sympathy for you and your family that I do, I'd like to ask them to please turn that sympathy into action. It is hypocritical to come up here, offer your thoughts and prayers, and then leave, continuing to double down on the policies that allow criminals and fentanyl into our country. The people suffering from this border crisis don't need platitudes. They need an end to these illegal policies and to see the man responsible for implementing them held to account. And that's what Republicans are doing here today. Migrants are also suffering as a result of Secretary Mayorkas' actions. On Secretary Mayorkas' watch, a record number of migrants have been found dead on U.S. soil. Since the start of FY 2022, CBP no longer even publicly reports the number, but Dr. Corrine Stern, the medical examiner in Webb County, Texas, said in August 22, and I quote, "I'm seeing an extreme increase in the number of border crossing deaths compared to other years. This is my busiest year in my career ever," end quote. Many of those who survived the journey have horror stories as well. Sadly, numerous migrants suffer sexual abuse and assault along the way. Then, San Diego Sector Chief Patrol Agent Aaron Heitke told our committee in May, and I quote, "It's very common that female migrants are raped during the process. Most of them believe it's just part of the payment as they go up," end quote. This hearing is about the human cost of Secretary Mayorkas' egregious misconduct and failure to fulfill his oath of office. The framers of our Constitution were clear that the executive branch officials were expected to follow their duty and enforce the laws of this country, and if they willfully failed to do so, they should no longer hold office. That is why we're here today. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses and letting them tell their stories about how this crisis has impacted them. Unfortunately, one of our witnesses, Sheriff Daniels, was not able to make it at the last minute, but we look forward to hearing from him at a future hearing or on a future border trip. With his permission, I would ask unanimous consent to submit his testimony for the record. Without objection, so ordered. Lastly, I'd like to point out that I have invited Secretary Mayorkas on multiple occasions to testify on the border crisis, including this hearing today. I'm disappointed that he has chosen not to testify. Instead, he plays games and cat and mouse, telling the media he wants to cooperate with the committee on finding a time to testify, but then refuses to work with the committee staff or offer any dates or times to which he can testify. Despite this behavior, and in lieu of his in-person testimony, I have invited him to submit testimony for the record, and I sincerely hope that he takes advantage of that offer. I'd like to ask unanimous consent for my letters inviting Secretary Mayorkas for testimony dated August 16, September 14, January 5, and January 7th to be entered into the record. Without objection, so ordered. I now recognize the ranking member, the gentleman from Mississippi, Mr. Thompson, for his opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Good morning. Before we begin today's hearing, I want to address misinformation my Republican colleagues are spreading, falsely alleging that Secretary Mayorkas is refusing to testify before this committee. Let me set the record straight. Secretary Mayorkas has testified before Congress more than any other cabinet secretary. He's appeared before this committee twice in the last year, including just 2 months ago when he testified for several hours about border security. His willingness to work with the committee has been a welcome change from the Trump administration, whose officials consistently refused to comply with congressional oversight. They ignored virtually every oversight letter and even defied a subpoena for their so-called acting secretary to appear before the committee. Secretary Mayorkas, however, has been forthright in dealing with Congress. In response to the chairman's request to testify at today's hearing on January 11th, 2024, the secretary sent a letter agreeing to make himself available to testify at a future mutually agreed upon date. However, the chairman has refused to accept. Instead, Republicans sent angry letters and tweets accusing the secretary of refusing to testify, knowing full well he said he would appear. Republicans are acting in bad faith. Unfortunately, that's nothing new. Months ago, Chairman Green promised donors at a campaign event that he'd bring an impeachment case against Secretary of Homeland Security Alejandro Mayorkas. He told his contributors to, quote, get the popcorn, and promised it's going to be fun, unquote. Before the committee had even begun its inquiry, Republicans had predetermined the outcome. But why did Republicans invite the secretary to testify only to refuse his offer to appear? The answer to that question appeared in the Hill newspaper last night. Mr. Chair, I ask unanimous consent to include in the record this article from the Hill describing how Republicans had set the date for the markup of articles of impeachment before holding the first hearing on this subject.
Without objection, so ordered.
According to an internal Republican memo dated January 10, 2024, Republicans had already scheduled a committee vote to impeach the secretary prior to holding a single impeachment hearing. Just as we've said all along, the outcome of Republicans' so-called impeachment investigation has been predetermined from the start. The chairman promised to follow the facts, but Republicans never really intended to do so. They are hurrying to adhere to an artificial timeline agreed in a backroom deal between Republican leadership, who's holding on by a thread, and its most extreme mega members. This isn't a real impeachment. It's a mega spectacle paid for by American tax dollars for Republican political gain. But through it all, Secretary Mayorkas remained committed to doing his job. The Department of Homeland Security's mission and the men and women who served with him at DHS. The Secretary is also committed to work diligently on a bipartisan basis to secure necessary funding for border security and to prepare the department for a possible shutdown. I wish my Republican colleagues would engage the Secretary to provide the department the funding it needs, but they have refused. I look forward to continuing to work with Secretary Mayorkas on critical Homeland Security issues facing the country and commend him for his unwavering commitment to duty even in the face of this sham impeachment. I also note for the record that when I asked at last week's hearing about providing the Secretary due process during the committee's impeachment proceedings, the chairman gave no substantive answers to my repeated inquiries. In fact, he seemed to have even considered providing the Secretary due process and appeared unprepared to respond. This is unfortunate, but not surprising. Again, this isn't a real impeachment. It's a predetermined, pre-planned partisan political stunt. Yesterday, the chairman threatened to hold Secretary Mayorkas in contempt for failing to appear before the committee, even though the secretary has already agreed to appear. That's not how contempt works. I can't help but wonder if Republicans are getting a bit desperate, especially after their hearing last week was a flop. It fell flat after their witnesses, 3 Republican politicians, rehashed old partisan talking points without so much as a shred of evidence to support their politically motivated claims for impeachment. The Democratic witness, respected impeachment expert and constitutional scholar, Professor Frank Bowman, testified, and I quote, "Policy differences, no matter how severe, no matter how heated, are simply not grounds for impeachment," unquote. You cannot impeach a cabinet secretary because you don't like a president's policies. That's not what impeachment is for. That's not what the Constitution says. Unfortunately, Republicans are willing to damage the Constitution they claim to hold dear because they think it will benefit them politically. Which brings us to today's hearing. I want to begin by expressing my deepest sympathies to Mrs. Noble and Mrs. Dunn on the tragic loss of your children. I cannot fathom your pain. As a father and a grandfather, my heart truly goes out to you. Indeed, our hearts go out to all those who've lost loved ones to drugs and violence, and we are committed to helping prevent future tragedies. Democrats want to strengthen border security. We want to keep fentanyl off our streets. We want to keep communities safe. We want to help those struggling with addiction. But impeachment will not do any of that. The fact is, impeachment is a waste of precious time that could be used to legislate on the urgent issues if only Republicans were willing to do. The Democratic witness today, Professor Deborah Pearlstein, is a constitutional law scholar, but in addition to her knowledge of impeachment, she's great expertise on the awesome power vested in Congress by the Constitution to effect change for the American people. That power is not through impeachment. As Professor Pearlstein stated in her testimony, and I quote, "Impeachment of Secretary Mayorkas can have no impact on the administration's exercise of immigration enforcement discretion, a power the Supreme Court has repeatedly recognized is vested by the Constitution in the executive branch," unquote. Instead, Congress' power comes from its ability to legislate. As Professor Pearlstein goes on to say, quote, "No branch of government has more power under our Constitution to address matters of border security than Congress," unquote. In other words, it's up to Congress to provide funding to interdict fentanyl, fix our broken immigration system, and provide help for those suffering from opioid addiction. That's our role in this, to use the power provided under the Constitution to legislate on important issues to help people who need it most, and not some baseless, senseless impeachment. I look forward to hearing from Professor Pearlstein about Congress's power to make meaningful progress on these and other issues. Mr. Chairman, I made this plea to you last week. It fell on deaf ears, but I'll try again. Let's drop this baseless impeachment and get back to doing the real work of securing the homeland and helping people across this great country. Before I yield back, Mr. Chairman, I have a parliamentary inquiry. I'd like to give you another chance at this one.
You're recognized.
Mr. Chairman, during our hearing last week, you said, quote, "The committee will follow the rules of the House," end quote, with regard to Secretary Mayorkas' due process. What provisions of House Rule 11 grants the Secretary representation before this committee?
Just a question of clarification on the parliamentary proceeding. What rule are you citing?
Rule 11.
Rule 11. The secretary is not appearing before the committee today, so his counsel is not necessary.
Mr. Chairman, we all know that Secretary Mayorkas has been willing to appear before this committee. He's not running from anything. He's been to the Capitol Hill 27 times since he was sworn in. My question is about due process, and there's nothing in the standing House rules that protects the Secretary's rights. So, Mr. Chairman, pursuant to Clause 2J1 of Rule 11, I'm furnishing you with a demand for a Minority Day hearing on this subject, signed by all the Democratic members of this committee.
So the demand is not proper. You have a witness present, so. Before, right?
Yeah, this is the unanimous consent that include in the record the article, but also I have this request for the.
You want this included in the record? Is that what you're asking?
Well, that's a request for a Minority Day for the committee.
Okay. So as I understand the rules, the request is only in order when you don't have a witness present. And today you have a witness present, so this is not in order.
Mr. Chairman, may I make a parliamentary inquiry on that?
Yeah.
Is this an impeachment inquiry?
You want to read the request? Yeah, this is actually a hearing, not an inquiry.
Is this part of an impeachment investigation?
This is an impeachment hearing.
Okay. Under impeachment precedent, separate and apart from this particular hearing, the minority is allowed to have a hearing of its own choice and its own witnesses. That has happened in every single impeachment in history. If this is going to be an impeachment process, then there have to be rights and due process afforded to the individual who is being impeached. And part of that, historically, under historic precedent, is that there is a minority day with minority-determined witnesses, not a minority witness who's added to a hearing that the majority determines.
So I want to make clear this supposed misinformation about the request to Secretary Mayorkas. There have been multiple requests, 4 in fact, of me to ask him to come and be a part of this. And he has, to the press, said yes, to me, not provided any dates, and at some date in the future. You can't, that's stonewalling. And so at some point after 4, I finally said, I guess it was Monday, well, just send us a testimony in writing. So far, we haven't seen that either. The effort to give Secretary Mayorkas an opportunity to come before the committee in this context has been made many times. I appreciate that the ranking member pointed out that he has been in front of our committee, but that was mandated by, the threats briefing. That's what he came for, was the threats briefing, not a part of this investigation on the southwest border. Every time we've invited him, he has refused to give us a date to come. So he's been afforded an opportunity to come.
I understand that, and that's a separate issue, whether or not Mr. Mayorkas wants to take part in his own impeachment inquiry. But the question for you is that as part of the House impeachment process, there must be afforded to the minority a hearing that the minority gets to determine, because it's an impeachment process. It is not a normal oversight investigation. What Secretary Mayorkas wants to do is a separate matter. I understand your view, and I understand the ranking member has a different view. I'm sure we will get all of the different letters in the record, and I have an article here saying that the DHS letter contradicts the GOP claim that Mayorkas refused to testify, which I could enter by unanimous consent. But we're just talking right now about the impeachment process, and in this committee, where it has never been done before, it's normally in the Judiciary Committee, that there has to be a minority day with minority determination.